Hello, and welcome to our lecture on the rise of totalitarian rulers in the time between the wars. After World War I, many nations struggled to rebuild. Remember, World War I was the most destructive war the world had ever seen, and the countries that was primarily fought in were basically in ruins. The Treaty of Versailles created bitterness among many nations, which we will go more into depth on in a minute. And a global depression in the 1930s led to high unemployment and a sense of desperation in Europe. These things all combined will create the perfect nesting ground for extreme totalitarian rulers to take over. Let's get back to the Treaty of Versailles. After World War I was over, all the countries involved got together in Paris at the Palace of Versailles to sign the peace treaty and set terms for the future. Some of these conditions that the losing party had to agree to included things like Germany has to accept all blame for the war. Side note, do you remember who actually started the war? Austria-Hungary. But they saw Germany as the main aggressor, so Germany has to take responsibility. The Treaty of Versailles also said that the Central Powers must pay for war reparations, which basically means they have to pay for the damages they caused to the Allies. They also make some other stipulations about how big the military in each of these countries can be and how many weapons they can produce, which is not very much. Then, US President Woodrow Wilson presents his 14 points, which is basically a list of 14 things he comes up with to deal with the aftermath of World War I and help ensure something like this doesn't happen again. Really, the only point that was successfully implemented is the idea of creating a League of Nations, which will have representatives from every major country, besides the Central Powers, who is in charge of creating a diplomatic atmosphere to resolve issues, before it results in a war. This later will be remade into the United Nations, but it won't have that name until after World War II. One thing to point out is that even though the US president came up with the idea, Congress will not allow the U.S. to join the League of Nations. They are afraid it would result in the U.S. having to get involved in issues that do not directly concern them. The Treaty of Versailles also makes a lot of territory changes in Europe, which mostly takes land away from the Central Powers to make sure they cannot become too powerful again. So it is in this climate of post-war uncertainty that nationalism again will be on the rise. This time, people will be united in their resentment of others and the shared struggles of their country, and they will turn to totalitarian dictators to rule their nation. These totalitarian dictators, who controlled all aspects of the government and the lives of their citizens, rose to power in the 1920s and 30s. They gained the support of their people by promising them jobs. They promoted national pride again, and they used a lot of propaganda. Once they gained power, they would hold on to it by using censorship, so eliminating freedom of speech. They used a lot of secret police forces and denied people their basic liberties. They also had a practice of eliminating any political rival that stood in their way or offered a different perspective. Among the first totalitarian dictators was Joseph Stalin of the newly formed Soviet Union. Stalin rose to power after the death of Vladimir Lenin, the first ruler of the new communist Soviet Union. Stalin furthered the communist agenda and promoted the seizure of all property, farms, and factories so that the state could control the economy and create equality amongst the people. No longer did any citizen hold more private wealth than anyone else. Well, supposedly. He will have his own secret police force to help make sure everyone is following the rules, and he will instigate what will later be called the Great Purge, where he eliminates anyone he considered to be a political power. So, when Stalin takes over, let's think about the state the Soviet Union was in. They had to exit World War I early because of all of the loss of life and resources. They realized they were not as industrialized as everyone else. In Stalin's own words, "We have fallen behind the advanced countries by 50 to 100 years. We must close that gap in 10 years. Either we do this or we will be crushed. This is what our obligations before the workers and peasants of the USSR dictate to us." So, to remedy this, Stalin creates a series of 5-year plans to get the country back on track. The plans all centered around agricultural production and industrialization. What Stalin would do was create super high goals for his people to meet, and basically made it where you were exiled to Siberia or a work camp if you couldn't complete your goals. So as you can imagine, most goals were met in Stalin's 5-year plans. In fact, the first 5-year plan was actually met ahead of schedule and only took 4 years to complete the goals. It was during this time Stalin starts to target his own peasant people to start his own form of genocide, but we will discuss this more in a later episode. So, Stalin is a communist, but not all totalitarian rulers will be communist. In fact, the next 2 people we will talk about will be fascist. So what is fascism? Well, it involves a government that is controlled by dictators, and they will use strict control and demand unwavering loyalty from their citizens. The biggest difference from communism is that fascists believe people should be able to keep their individual property, and they were a little less controlling of the economy. Property will actually be a way these fascist governments will be able to threaten and control their citizens. Loyal people gained property. Disloyal citizens lose everything. Fascist governments will start to appear in Italy, Germany, and Spain in the aftermath of World War I. Mussolini, the leader of Italy, and Hitler, a man I'm sure needs no introduction, both believed in fascism, the idea that nations need strong dictators and total authority by one political party to run the government, but that people should be able to keep their own property and businesses. Let's look a little closer at Benito Mussolini, who actually will be the first to coin the term fascism. He will name his new political party the Fascist Party after the fasces, a Roman symbol of authority and power. So here we are again, modeling things after Rome. So let's think back real quickly to Italy during World War I. They fought on the Allies' side, the winning side, but at the Treaty of Versailles, they really didn't get anything they felt like made it all worth their trouble. The Italian economy was terrible after the war. Their military was in shambles because they, 1, didn't have the men to fill it after the war, and 2, they did not have the money to build new weapons. Italy also kind of missed out on the whole imperialism thing. So while everyone else was able to fall back a little on their overseas colonies, Italy did not really have that option. So Italy was really struggling when a charismatic leader named Benito Mussolini took the stage. Mussolini gained popularity by promising to revive the economy, rebuild the military, and expand Italy's territory to create a new Roman Empire. We haven't heard that one before, have we? Mussolini also created his own secret police force, which he will call the Blackshirts. And as you can see from their uniforms, they actually wore black shirts. Very original name, I know. But they didn't always wear these uniforms. They often dressed in plain clothes, and you never knew which of your neighbors were informers. This secret police force was created to ensure that the goals of the Fascist Party were enforced at all times. By 1922, Mussolini was popular enough to lead a march on Rome, where he forced the King of Italy to name him the new prime minister. So the concept of a dictator would not seem that strange or necessarily bad to the Italian people. They had a monarchy up until this point in time, and while they did have some representation in their government, there was not the sense of democracy that existed in other parts of Europe. As Prime Minister, Benito Mussolini was most often referred to as Il Duce, or the Chief. So as the leader of Italy, he will end all democratic practices and all opposing political parties. Mussolini will build up the military to create new jobs for the unemployed of Italy, and then he starts to use his new army to conquer new territories in Africa for Italy. So finally, Italy is really going to jump into this imperialism game. One of the other fascist groups rising during this time will be the Nazi Party in Germany. After World War I, the German people had lost their sense of loyalty to their monarchy, the Weimar Republic. The people blamed the king for getting them into the war, and then the aftermath of them losing the war and crippling their economy. They saw him as the traitor that signed the Treaty of Versailles and put them in the terrible situation Germany was now in. Germany's economy was terrible after the war. Their inflation was so bad that their money basically became worthless. People would burn their cash for fire fuel versus standing in line to spend it on food that wouldn't be there when they got to the front of the line. Adolf Hitler will be the rising star of the Nazi Party. I think many of my students have the misunderstanding that Hitler started the Nazi Party, but that's not true. It already existed, and he joined and made it to be the powerful party that it was. Hitler became so powerful that he thought he could successfully march on the capital and take over the government. This first attempt to grab at power was unsuccessful, and he'll be arrested and serve 9 months in jail. When he gets out, Hitler spends some time studying Mussolini's tactics and used many of his ideas to strengthen the Nazi Party. While in jail, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, which translates to mean My Plan, where he literally outlines his exact plans for the Nazi Party in Germany. So when you hear German people say that they didn't know Hitler's true intentions, I feel that's very hard to believe, since he literally wrote down all of his intentions in this book that was widely published at the time. In this book, he wrote that Germans were members of a superior race called the Aryan race, and all other races were inferior. He also stated that Germans needed Lebensraum, or living space, and that to get more space, they needed to take back the land that was stolen from them after World War I. And he even went as far to say that Germany should conquer Eastern Europe and Russia. Pretty bold statements. When Hitler was released from jail in 1924, he spent years organizing the Nazis into Germany's most powerful political party. In 1933, Hitler was named the Chancellor of Germany through an election, and then once he was elected, he named himself dictator. He will call his new government the Third Reich, or the Third Reign, to promote national pride and nationalism. Hitler will put the Germans back to work by having them build factories, highways, weapons, and by increasing their military, most of which all violate the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. He will develop and increase his own secret police force called the Gestapo to eliminate rivals and control all aspects of Germany. In 1935, Hitler began a series of anti-Semitic laws called the Nuremberg Laws that deprived German Jews of their rights as citizens. Hitler had always been active in his dislike and distrust of Jewish people. He saw them as disloyal to Germany and a menace to their society. When the Nuremberg Laws, he also forbade mixed Jewish marriages and required all Jews to identify themselves by wearing a yellow star. In 1938, Hitler took this a step further when he ordered the Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. This was a series of attacks on Jewish synagogues and businesses all over these major German cities. In fact, if you look on the map here on the right, those are all the different cities, the little red dots, where the Kristallnacht took effect. We will come back to Hitler and the effects he had for Germany and the world later on when we talk about World War II. Our last major totalitarian ruler will come from Japan. After World War I, Japan was the strongest nation in Asia and was ready to conquer new lands to provide resources for Japanese industry. Emperor Hirohito gave full control of the Japanese military over to a man named Hideko Tojo, who will serve as a military dictator. If you remember anything about Japanese history, you'll remember that for almost 600 years, Japan was ruled by a military dictator. So this new leadership change will not be alarming for the Japanese people. In the 1930s, Japan, Italy, and Germany began aggressively expanding into new territories, and these actions are what will most directly cause the actions that start World War II in 1939. Italy will expand into Albania and Ethiopia, which, side note, shout out to Ethiopia, the only country in Africa able to stay independent through the first round of imperialism. And then Japan will invade Manchuria, northern China, as well as Indochina, and the East Indies. And finally, Germany annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia. And those are the actions that bring members of the League of Nations into World War II. Thanks for watching this segment about totalitarian rulers in the time between the world wars. Next time, we will dive into World War II.